This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. And I am so excited today to welcome back to the show, Helene Harrison. Helen, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me back. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, the last time you were on, we had such a good time that I wanted you to come back and talk about an earlier book that you had done on the Elizabethan Rebellions. So I'm so excited to talk about this because this is a topic that I honestly have not studied very much. Rebellions, battles, those types of things have always honestly just bored me. I know they shouldn't, but there's nothing. I just love like the relationships between people and that part of the story. So this part really brings together a more full picture of what life was like in the Tudor era. So before we get into it, I have to ask you the standard question. Why did you pick this topic?
My first sort of real introduction to the Tudors was a module I did during my A-levels. So I would have been about 17 on Tudor rebellions. So I actually studied it as part of my A-level qualification. That was largely focused on sort of earlier rebellions. We did Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, Pilgrimage of Grace. But then when my publisher approached me and said, oh, we're looking for someone to write on this subject, I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I knew a lot about some of the rebellions and nothing about the others. So it was quite a mixed bag for me to get into with this one. But yeah, I sort of jumped at the chance to sort of go back to my A-levels a bit and write about stuff that really I hadn't visited for a lot of years. So that was sort of how it came about, really.
I love this because you don't just talk about Elizabethan rebellions. You also kind of go back to the beginning of the Tudors. And I found it very interesting to see how the number of rebellions increased the closer, like we got closer to Elizabeth. And then all of a sudden there's like a whole bunch. But let's go back to Henry VII, because I think that's probably some of the most well-known rebellions. Instead of me telling everybody what they are, why don't we just start with Henry VII and talk about maybe what you might consider the most famous rebellions?
Yeah, there's sort of two critical ones under Henry VII, which was Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, who were both pretenders to the throne. And if anyone wants these in a lot of detail, Nathan Amin has written a brilliant book on Henry VII and the Tudor pretenders, which I'd really, really recommend. That was sort of my go-to book when I was sort of drafting this section. But yeah, I start with Henry VII because I think it's important to understand what Elizabeth would have known about rebellions before she came to the throne, and she probably would have heard about these. She obviously would have known about Henry VIII's determination that the succession would be male. And so, yeah, Lambert Simnel was within 2 years of Henry VII coming to the throne, so it happened pretty quickly. And we know Henry VII obviously came to the throne through a battle. His claim to the throne wasn't particularly strong. It was through an illegitimate line, through his mother. And Lambert Simnel sort of claimed that he was one of the Yorkist heirs to the throne, so the Earl of Warwick, who was Richard III's nephew. And it didn't really last very long. It didn't particularly capture the imagination of people. And Simnel was captured at the Battle of Stoke, and he was actually put to work in the palace kitchens. So he wasn't executed. I think it was probably thought he wasn't to blame. But the Earl of Lincoln was killed in the battle. He was one of the backers. And Francis Lovell just seems to sort of vanish from the historical record. We don't know whether he did die at that point or if he did manage to escape, but he just seems to vanish completely. So yeah, Lambert Simnel seems to have got off pretty lightly. He actually became the king's falconer later on. So he did, as far as we know, he did live into the reign of Henry VIII as well. And then a couple of years later, we hear about Perkin Warbeck, and this was a much more extended sort of rebellion. We first sort of really hear him gaining followers in sort of 1490, 1491. And he's finally executed in 1499. So it's quite an extended period we hear about this one. And he actually pretended to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. So he claimed that he'd been rescued from the Tower and sent to live abroad, and that he'd come back to claim his rightful throne. And he did get quite a lot of support. He had the support of the Emperor Maximilian, Margaret of Austria, sorry, not Margaret of Austria, Margaret of York, who was ruling in the Low Countries. So he did get quite a lot of international support as well. He had a lot of support in Ireland. And he did go through a coronation in Dublin as well as King Richard IV. But again, it all just sort of fell apart. He sort of raided into England from Scotland. He was eventually captured and put in the Tower, where he remained for a couple of years. And he was eventually executed along with the Earl of Warwick in 1499. So it's quite an extended period, but I think we see these rebellions happen because Henry VII he didn't have the claim to the throne, and there were a lot of other claimants sort of hanging around with uncertain statuses. So it sort of lent itself to people being able to rebel against him.
Well, I think you may have already alluded to how you feel about Perkin Warbeck. So do you think he really was one of the princes in the Tower?
I don't know. I think he was a pretender, though I know there has recently been a lot of discussion around the princes in the Tower as to who exactly Simnel and Warbeck were. But I think Nathan Amin makes a really good argument in his book that he was a pretender and not one of the princes. I do believe the princes probably died in 1483. But again, I don't think you can blame Richard III necessarily for that. They were in his custody, but was he actually the perpetrator? We don't know.
Yeah.
But that's a completely different question.
Yeah, we're not here to talk about the princes in the Tower today, but I couldn't resist asking that question. You always want to know what everybody's opinion is on the matter.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go from Henry VII, who secured the throne through battle, and he had his own challenges with Warbeck and Simnel. Then we move to his son, Henry VIII. Of course, Henry VIII was not meant to be Henry VII's heir.
Yes.
So when we move to the reign of Henry VIII, what is the first rebellion?
Well, we have sort of the amicable grant. There's a small rebellion around that in 1525, but really the major rebellion under Henry VIII is the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. So we only really see major rebellion under Henry VIII once he starts implementing the religious changes and the dissolution of the monasteries. So this rebellion broke out across sort of the whole of the north of England, was largely against the dissolution of the monasteries, and it was led by a lawyer called Robert Aske, although we do see some sort of noble and clerical support as well. Thomas Darcy gets involved. Whether under duress or not still seems to be questioned, but he did definitely sympathise with the aims of the rebels. And they managed to, their support was sort of phenomenal for that age, sort of tens of thousands of people it's estimated at one point. But again, estimates vary a lot as to how many people were actually involved. But Henry VIII seemed shocked that this would happen. It seems some of his advisors had told him that the people welcomed the religious changes. So Henry sent the Duke of Norfolk to go and deal with it and put the rebels down. But the suggestion is that Norfolk actually promised them a lot of different concessions, that there would be a parliament at York, that Jane Seymour would even be crowned at York. I don't think Henry VIII ever had any intention of keeping any of them. He needed these rebels to disperse. And in the end, there were quite a lot of executions as a result of it. Robert Aske was hanged in chains. Darcy was beheaded. And even a lot of just the followers were sort of rounded up and hung. So it was quite a brutal sort of putting down of this rebellion. Then we don't really see any other rebellions for the rest of Henry VIII's reign, particularly. There's nothing that sort of stands out, and there's nothing that reaches the sort of magnitude of the Pilgrimage of Grace either.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that he only really had that one rebellion, and it was almost 30 years into his reign before it happened.
Yeah, we just see little sort of pockets before that, like around the amicable grant and things like that. But yeah, it's quite amazing that there is just really this one major rebellion, and it is quite a distance into his reign, only once he's made these massive religious changes.
Yeah, considering how controversial he was as a king, it just blows my mind that there was only one.
Yeah.
So
maybe people were just too scared of him.
yeah, maybe he was like, "I'll chop off your head, so don't you dare." Ruled with an iron fist, didn't he? Well, Henry VIII then died in January of 1547. His son Edward ascended the throne, and Edward was, I don't know, he didn't reign very long. It was what, 5, 6 years off the top of my... Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how many rebellions happened during the reign of Edward VI? Because I can only think of one.
Well, we have two that sort of happen concurrently. They're often sort of conflated together, but they were two separate rebellions happening almost simultaneously. So we have the Kent Rebellion, which breaks out in Norfolk, in East Anglia. And then we have the Western Rebellion, which breaks out in the West Country pretty much at the same time. So they're both 1549. The Kent Rebellion's probably the better known because people recognise the name of Robert Kett. And that was largely actually against enclosure, social and religious change. And it ended up with this massive camp on Mousehold Heath outside Norwich. And people will often remember the famous oak tree that he's said to have stood under and made this proclamation of what the rebel aims were. But again, that was put down. John Dudley, who we later would find as Duke of Northumberland, was sent to quash it. And some say that it's this point where we start to see the fall of Edward Seymour. As Lord Protector, we see Dudley being so successful in putting this rebellion down, and Seymour was said to have been sympathetic towards the rebels. So we sort of see a change of power happening at this time. And the Western Rebellion is also known as the Prayer Book Rebellion. So that was against the introduction of the new Book of Common Prayer by Archbishop Cranmer. Again, also put down. We don't see sort of the massive reprisals that we saw after the Pilgrimage of Grace, but again, there are executions that do happen. It's the two rebellions are often conflated into one, but they are definitely two separate rebellions in two separate areas of the country. So
I want to go back to Kett's and talk about what enclosures are exactly, because I think as Americans, there's going to be a lot of people who don't necessarily understand what they are and why it was a problem. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so enclosure is a problem that we started to see more of in the Tudor period. In the medieval period, you had a lot of common land that people could use for grazing animals on, and it was sort of used by the whole community. And in the Tudor period, we start to see this common land being enclosed by landowners, so it can't be used by the community. So they've got less space where they can graze their animals because there's less common land. And this was really a problem for people because they didn't have the other land to use, which meant their animals weren't able to graze as much. And it was just seen as another way for sort of the landowners to gain more power and more control. And it caused a lot of problems for the common people, and they really didn't like it. And that's sort of where this rebellion comes from, really. And Ket is actually, he had enclosed some of his land previously, and as part of the rebellion, it's said that he actually pulled his own fences down to give the land back to common use.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that. That's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I was a bit surprised sort of the first time I read that. I thought, oh, okay, so he was a landowner who enclosed this land and then joined this rebellion and pulled his own fences down.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit odd. I remember when I was in England and I was in Devon, I remember seeing a plaque about the Prayer Book Rebellion. I don't even remember exactly where it was, but it was like the spot of some big battle in Devon, and I need to find that picture now that I took. I remember it was like early evening and the sun was setting and it was raining, and I didn't get a very good picture, but I remember like thinking, sitting there, taking that picture, that wow, this is a very historic spot that I'm at right now, and trying to picture it in my mind's eye, what played out.
Yeah, I think in England you see a lot of that. You can just walk somewhere and you'll suddenly like see a plaque or something. You'd be like, oh, I didn't know that happened here. It happens around sort of corners. You just don't expect it, which is sort of a nice thing about living in England, I guess.
It's just history everywhere.
Literally, yes. Every corner.
Okay, so Edward VI had those two rebellions. Let's move on to now. Edward VI died, and Lady Jane Grey is proclaimed queen.
Yes.
Let's talk about why that was a problem, first of all.
Well, the will of Henry VIII specified the line of succession as Edward VI and his heirs, Mary I, as she would be, and her heirs, and then Elizabeth and her heirs. And then after that, it was to go to the line of Henry's younger sister, Mary. Not the older sister, Margaret, whose heirs were ruling in Scotland, but his younger sister, Mary. And Jane Grey was Mary's granddaughter. So she was in the line of succession, but she wasn't at the top of it. But then when Edward is ill and he realizes he's dying, he writes his device for the succession to say that he is removing his half-sisters from the succession, and he wants the line to pass. Originally, it's to the male heirs of Jane Grey, but there is a handwritten amendment to say Jane Grey and her male heirs. So I think Edward obviously realised he's dying soon. Jane's not going to have a son before that happens.
Yeah.
So yes, we see Jane Grey proclaimed queen, and it's a couple of days after Edward's death before it happens, because they're trying to get everything in place. But they fail to capture Mary. People are sent to go and get her. She's even summoned to London to say, you need to come and see your brother, he's not well. But neither Mary or Elizabeth make the trip. And yeah, so Jane is proclaimed without Mary in custody. So Mary proclaims herself queen at the same time. And then we have this sort of 9-day period where no one quite knows who's going to end up being queen. Is there going to be a war? But yeah, in the end, it seems Jane's support in London just sort of vanishes. The Privy Council leave the Tower, go to Mary and proclaim her queen. She's at Framlingham in Suffolk at the time. And in the end, even the Duke of Northumberland gives up and proclaims Mary queen at Cambridge. And then Mary travels in triumph to London, joined by Elizabeth en route before she makes her grand entrance to the city.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes.
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
You've maxed out your 401k, you're contributing to an IRA, and making some other investments. You're ahead of the game and doing well. But where do you go from here? The same old story can only get you so far. If you want a new take from a new type of financial professional, we invite you to get a fresh perspective beside an agent with the backing of New York Life. Insurance, investments, retirement, and more. Visit NYL.com to learn more. Investments are offered through registered representatives of NYLife Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a New York Life company.
Yeah, that time period with all of that happening, it really sometimes makes you scratch your head a little bit and go, what were they thinking? Did they really think that they could pull this off?
Yeah. Yeah, and it can be considered to be the first rebellion of Mary's reign, really. It depends who you actually consider to be queen during that 13-day period.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think because Mary's the victor, Jane is seen as a rebel, whereas if Jane had been the victor, Mary would have been the rebel. So it's often which point of view you ascribe to.
Oh, so, okay. So now Mary is Mary the First of England. Well, of course, then she wasn't called Mary the First of England. She was just Queen Mary because she was the first. So now she is queen. She also didn't reign very long. What did her reign look like as far as pushback and rebellions?
The main sort of pushback we have is when Mary decides, only about less than 6 months into her reign, she decides she's going to marry Philip II of Spain. And there's a lot of outcry at this. The English are worried about a Spanish takeover of England, that England would become an outpost of this larger sort of Spain and the empire. Because at this point, Philip's father, Charles V, is still alive. He will die within a couple of years, but at this point he is still alive, so there's the chance that England could be absorbed into the Holy Roman Empire as well as just becoming a Spanish outpost. And this is the one where we also see the first sort of real danger to Elizabeth, given that we're talking about Elizabethan rebellions. So we do see the first danger to Elizabeth here. But Thomas Wyatt, the younger, the elder, is the one who was rumoured to be a lover of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. But we see his son, Thomas Wyatt, raising men in Kent to march on London. And it was supposed to be sort of several pronged attacks. So Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, Jane Grey's father, was supposed to be raising men further north to march on London. But the only sort of rebels that really got off the ground were Thomas Wyatt's, and they marched from Kent to the gates of London. But Mary I made this sort of incredible speech at the Guildhall that sort of rallied all the Londoners together, and they closed the gates on Wyatt so he couldn't get into the city. And it just he sort of walked around London and tried to get in at various different points and try and get across the river at different points, and it just never really happened for him. And sort of the rebels started to melt away. Wyatt was seized. Henry Grey was found hiding, and he was taken as well. And the sort of focus of Wyatt's rebellion was not only to stop Mary's marriage to Philip, but to actually replace Mary on the throne with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was supposed to marry Edward Courtenay, who was the Earl of Devon. And he also had a claim to the throne through the Yorkist line as well. So it was supposed to sort of empower sort of the two claims together and replace Mary, which is where we see the danger to Elizabeth. And she's summoned to London by Mary once the danger's sort of passed. And she's actually imprisoned in the Tower of London for a while, questioned, although they could never actually prove any involvement of her at all. And she was actually let out of the tower on the anniversary of her mother's execution on the 19th of May, 1554. She was released. So that must have been quite terrifying for her. Being in the same place her mother died 18 years afterwards.
Yeah, it really does make one wonder if it was their intent to release her on that day to send a message.
I think it was very purposeful of Mary that that's the one day she decided to release.
Is it just me, or is it odd, though, that there was any significance to the May 19th day, considering that they wanted to erase Anne from history. Like the fact that
Yeah.
people still remembered that date kind of surprises me a little bit.
Yes, but I think with Mary, because of it was, she always saw it as Anne Boleyn being the one who'd put her in this horrible position and replaced her mother. I think probably Anne was on Mary's mind a bit more than most, I would say.
Okay, so let's move forward then to the topic of your book. Now we're like half hour into this conversation. We're up to the Elizabethan rebellions. And I think the one thing, and I talked to you about this beforehand, was it kind of surprised me how long Elizabeth's reign was peaceful before there was the first rebellion. And the reason behind the first rebellion and who was involved, I guess, shouldn't have surprised me, but it did a little bit. So let's talk about that. How long did it take from the time she ascended the throne to the first rebellion?
Well, Elizabeth came to the throne in November 1558. And then we have this sort of, it's all the wrangling over the religious settlement and what Elizabeth's religious beliefs and motivations actually are, and then questions over our marriage. But we don't actually see a rebellion for 11 years. So we have Mary, Queen of Scots, fleeing Scotland, having abdicated her throne, and she arrives in England in 1568, so nearly 10 years after Elizabeth comes to the throne. And then we see the first rebellion the following year. So it's too much of a coincidence for it not to be linked. And my book, it sort of goes through all of the rebellions, but the focus of it is this sort of Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots almost rivalry it runs through all of the rebellions apart from the last one I discuss. So that sort of undercurrent does run all the way through these. It starts right within 10 years of Elizabeth coming to the throne, and before that it seems to be peaceful.
Everything was fine until that Scottish queen showed up.
Yeah.
So what was the name of the first rebellion in 68?
Well, the first rebellion, I call it the Northern Rising, but it's also called the Rising of the North or the Rising of the Northern Earls. So it does have several names, which can be complicated when you're trying to research it.
Yeah, I bet.
Everyone calls it something different. But yeah, it was 1569, so it happened only a year after Mary Queen of Scots arrived in England. Definitely, I don't think it's a coincidence. It was led by two Northern Earls. So we have Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland, so from my neck of the woods where I live, and Charles Neville, who was the 6th Earl of Westmoreland. The Nevilles and the Percys were two of the most prominent Northern families. And rumours spread of a proposed marriage between Mary Queen of Scots and Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, who was also a cousin to Elizabeth I.
Yeah.
Obviously through her mother, who was a Boleyn. But Norfolk was actually imprisoned almost just to stop him taking part in the rising. Like, they expected him to be involved, so as a preventative measure, stick him in the Tower of London so he's out of harm's way. And the rebels claimed they wanted to release Mary Queen of Scots from where she'd effectively been imprisoned for the last year, and ensure that she was named as Elizabeth's heir. Because obviously at this point Elizabeth hadn't married. She was not really showing any intention of marrying. And they wanted to make sure there was an heir in place in case something happened to Elizabeth. She'd already had an outbreak of smallpox. She'd survived that already. They were already thinking about the succession just 10 years into her reign.
Wow.
The rebels reached out to the Spanish for help through the ambassador, and they also wanted the return of Roman Catholicism to England, which obviously, having Mary Queen of Scots as the heir, she was a Catholic, so that would have happened in time. But the rebels seem to have travelled all over the north of England through October and into November. Thirsk, York is a notable northern city, Northallerton, and Durham as well. And actually, at Durham Cathedral, the rebels destroyed the Protestant prayer book that they had in the cathedral there and said mass for the first time in a decade. And I visited Durham Cathedral for the first time in quite a lot of years, considering how close it is to me. And yeah, it's quite an amazing place, actually. I mean, I'm not religious, but you get the sort of real sense of what it must have been like at that point to have these different religious services. And there was said to be around 800 people hearing mass that day. So it wasn't just a full sort of hardcore section. There was quite a lot of people there. And that just gave a sort of massive show of support for the rebels. And I write about in my book how there's a suggestion that making the rebellion a religious cause might have had more support than Mary Queen of Scots as a successor. So there seems to have been some thought into exactly how they're pushing ahead with this rebellion. But Elizabeth I was obviously concerned about Mary, and actually had Mary moved south. She was at Coventry. No, she was at Tutbury, sorry. And then she was moved to Coventry. So she was further south, further away from the rebels, so that they couldn't get to her. And the rebels did sort of head for Tutbury, where she was, and then realised that actually she's been moved and she's not there anymore. And the rebels soon began to disperse, and the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland actually fled north into Scotland. And there were quite a few executions, at least sort of 300 to 500 is the current estimate. And others were convicted but later reprieved. Westmoreland was actually never caught. He fled to the continent and died in the Netherlands, I believe. But Northumberland was captured in 1572. So he lasted a couple of years. And he was returned to England and executed. But he was made a saint then in 1895.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Still remembered. And yeah, he was made a saint at that point. So.
Was this also when the 4th Duke of Norfolk was executed, or was that later?
No, he survives a couple more years. We've got another rebellion that he gets involved in before he's finally executed. But they were obviously worried he was going to get involved, hence the preemptive imprisonment before he could.
Yeah, and I suspect, like his grandfather, that he was also a Catholic.
Yeah, it's thought the Howards were generally a Catholic family. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, certainly was. Henry Howard, who's the 4th Duke's father and the 3rd Duke's son, was executed by Henry VIII. His religious beliefs seem a bit more under question. He may have actually had some reformist leanings. And there have been questions over the 4th Duke as well, whether he just asserted his Catholicism in hopes of marriage to Mary Queen of Scots. So that's been quite interesting to look into as well.
It just seems like Mary Queen of Scots was just a figurehead for these rebellions. They were like, well, we want Catholicism back. So she's a Catholic. Let's put her, because she's also a Tudor, kind of.
She has Tudor blood in her veins. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but of course she could never actually get involved because she was kept under guard. So yeah, at this point she's definitely sort of a figurehead, but I don't think she would have necessarily disagreed with the rebels.
Okay, so Thomas Howard was arrested. He was put in the Tower. You said there were hundreds of people that were executed for this rebellion. Things calmed down, I assume, for a little bit. What happened at that point?
Yeah, so we have the rebellion sort of lasts through October and November 1569. And Pope Pius V actually issues a bull of excommunication against Elizabeth I at this point. It was suggested it was supposed to encourage the rebels, but by the time the bull arrived, the rebellion had already been put down. So at that point, it had sort of already failed. But it was supposed to sort of add an air of legality to the rebels' actions. And it was issued in sort of the beginning of 1570, we see it come out. So it basically was a command for the English people to overthrow Elizabeth, that they didn't have to obey her anymore. And Mary Queen of Scots would have been probably the favoured heir, though there were several others hanging around in sort of Edward Seymour, the son of Catherine Grey, and Arbella Stewart later in the reign is considered an alternate, but she's not quite in the picture at this point. But yes, it's quiet for a year or so. There might have been some sort of thoughts going on in the background, but we don't see any sort of action until 1571. We have Norfolk released from the Tower after the Northern Rising's over. He's sort of kept under house arrest for a bit, and then it's sort of just quietly he's sort of allowed to go about his business again. So then we come to the Ridolfi Plot in 1571, and this one and the Throckmorton Plot are actually, I don't always call them rebellions because they never actually sort of came to fruition at all.
Oh.
Just sort of, there was a lot of this background plotting going on, but there was never actually sort of a rising like we saw in 1569. And the Ridolfi Plot is named for Roberto de Ridolfi. That's a mouthful to say. And he was an Italian who moved to London during Mary I's reign. And he began to communicate with Roman Catholics in England during Elizabeth's reign. So he was involved in the proposals for Mary Queen of Scots to marry Thomas Howard. He sort of carried letters between them. And in January 1571, so right at the beginning of the year, so there was only about a year of quiet, really, between sort of the excommunication and the next plot breaking out. And Thomas Howard wrote to Mary Queen of Scots about this plot that was sort of brewing. Ridolfi had travelled to the Netherlands to see the Duke of Alba, to Spain to see Philip II, and to Rome to visit the Pope. So he was really trying to get this sort of international support for the revolt. And the Pope blessed the uprising, but wouldn't give any more concrete assistance at all. He just sort of said, good luck, here you go. And the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands sort of dismissed Ridolfi. He wasn't convinced that it would work. Wasn't convinced by the assurances that they could release Mary from her captivity and overthrow Elizabeth sort of all at the same time. And one of Mary's staunch supporters, John Leslie, the Bishop of Ross, was arrested in the summer of 1571. Some say he was tortured. That's sort of a bit questionable, we're not entirely sure, but he did tell Elizabeth's sort of advisors what he knew of the plot. And Norfolk was again arrested and sent to the Tower. But he claimed that he refused to have anything to do with the plot, even though they had his signature on letters about the plot. So I don't think his denials did much. But Norfolk's house was also searched, and they found sort of a half-written letter to Mary that had been writing when they arrived.
Oh my gosh!
They found stuff sort of hidden in various different places, so it seemed fairly obvious he had been communicating with Mary. How much he knew of what was planned is unclear, but he certainly knew something was going on. So it was very definitely misprision of treason, if not outright treason.
They're like, oh, hang on here, Norfolk. We found a letter that you were writing, and he's like, oh, that thing? Yeah, I was just scribbling, and
yeah, nothing really. I was just practicing.
I was just practicing my penmanship.
Yeah, exactly. Mary Queen of Scots was once again moved, just in case the rebels could manage to get hold of her. So she was taken to Sheffield Castle this time. But Elizabeth seems to have been strangely reluctant to execute Norfolk. He was, of course, family. His grandfather was also Elizabeth's great uncle. I think that's the right connection.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So he was family, and Elizabeth did always keep a lot of her Howard and Boleyn relatives quite close. We see this with Catherine Carey. Or Catherine Knowles, as she became when she married. But the suggestion is that Elizabeth actually executed Norfolk in order to save Mary Queen of Scots. There were calls this early on for Mary to be executed, and Elizabeth was not willing to let that happen. So it's perfectly possible that she agreed to Norfolk's execution in order to save Mary. So Norfolk was executed on the 2nd of June in 1572. So we can see that gap between the rebellion and Norfolk being executed. is probably Elizabeth going backwards and forwards and negotiating over what was going to happen. And Ridolfi actually, he fled England and ended his life as a senator in Florence. So he was never caught, never prosecuted. There's been some suggestions that perhaps Ridolfi may have been a double agent. He may have been there to try and entrap Norfolk and Mary, which is why he managed to get away. We don't have any concrete evidence, but given what we see happen later with the Babington Plot, it does seem plausible that may have happened. We're not sure.
You can't help but just feel for Elizabeth, because she, of all of the Tudor monarchs, really had the most problem with people wanting to take her throne or remove her from her. I mean, she had a lot of people who could have technically been in the line of succession. You know, if we look at Catherine Grey as an example, right? She's just one. There's a handful of them versus her father or her grandfather or even her siblings.
Yeah, we do see, I think with Edward and Mary's reigns, we don't see this many sort of heirs to the throne sort of coming out, whereas by Elizabeth's reign they've all sort of started to breed, and we have all of these extra children coming out of the woodwork. Whereas I think had Mary been on the throne for longer, it might well have sort of broken into rebellion. But because her reign was so short, I don't think there was really the sort of number of heirs that we see developing into Elizabeth's reign.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And also later have our Bella Stuart as well.
Yes.
The Scottish line sort of staking claims to things as well. And of course, we know the Scottish line does triumph with James I in the end. But yeah, I think Elizabeth's reign is sort of the time where they have all started to breed, and we do see these sort of secret marriages and children sort of coming out, which we don't really see in Edward and Mary's reigns.
Okay, so here we are. What year did you say? 1571, 1572? Yes. Okay.
Norfolk's just been executed in 1572, yeah.
Yeah, and Mary, Queen of Scots, is still in the picture.
Yes, she's still imprisoned.
And the rebellions continue. So Norfolk has been executed. These rebellions are over. What's next? What happens next?
We actually have quite a quiet period now. So, yeah, Norfolk was executed in 1572. The next sort of major plot or rebellion that I look at isn't until 1583.
Oh.
So we sort of have a sort of quiet period. No doubt there is still background plotting going on, but it's not to the point where we sort of really hear about it or we have these named plots or rebellions. So no doubt there were still letters flying around and people talking about what they want to do, but we just don't see it. We don't have any sort of real evidence for it. So yeah, the Throckmorton plot sort of comes in the early 1580s, and it's another plot like the Ridolfi plot that doesn't really come to anything in the end. It just sort of, it's all this backroom plotting without anything actually coming of it. So it was named for Francis Throckmorton, who was born into a Catholic family. And the family seat was at, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this. I think it's Cofton Court. Cofton Court? I'm not entirely sure. But it's also later where the wives of the gunpowder plotters waited for news in 1605. So we've still got that Catholic connection coming in years down the line. But Throckmorton had travelled abroad quite a lot. And he'd met Catholic agents like Thomas Morgan, Charles Paget, and Throckmorton actually ended up on his return to England acting as a go-between for Mary Queen of Scots and the Spanish ambassador Mendoza. So he acted as sort of a representative in England, but he wasn't actually the instigator of the plot, despite the plot having his name. So the sort of main plotting actually seems to have happened in France, which is interesting. So whether the French sort of have a different name for this plot, I'm not sure. Whether they do call it the Throckmorton plot or whether they have a different name, I'm not sure. But we have Henry, Duke of Guise, who was a relative of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her mother was Mary of Guise. He convened a meeting in Paris in summer 1583. And this meeting was intended to plan an invasion of England, backed by Philip II of Spain again. He keeps popping up. And we're now on Pope Gregory XIII, because Pope Pius died in just after the Ridolfi Plot. And Mary was informed of the plans, but her and Throckmorton were unaware that Throckmorton was actually being followed. So Elizabeth's agents knew he was going backwards and forwards from the French embassy. They knew where this plot was happening and what was going on. So Throckmorton was actually arrested in November 1583. And the meeting in France was in summer, so June 1483. So it's quite a small sort of period of time. And it seems that the government became aware of the plot quite early on, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, the main evidence we have from the time is actually a government propaganda leaflet written by Elizabeth's government, which is called A Discovery of the Treasons Practiced and Attempted Against the Queen's Majesty.
Oh.
The suggestion is that it was possibly authored by either Cecil or Walsingham, possibly both working together. But the leaflet says that the plot intended to release the Scottish Queen from her imprisonment, and it says to procure, even by force from the Queen's Majesty, a tolerance in religion. So again, we've still got this religious focus with Mary Queen of Scots, but the intention was, if the Queen refused to do that, that they would remove Elizabeth from the throne and put Mary in her place, and that would then restore Catholicism anyway. But Throckmorton could be punished. It was easy enough to punish him and to execute him. Whereas a lot of the foreign conspirators were out of reach. In France, the centre of this plot was in France. So there perhaps weren't as many executions as we might have expected from this plot, because so many people were actually out of reach. And for instance, Thomas Morgan we'll see pop up again in the Babington Plot. So they keep plotting because the English government couldn't get hold of them.
Yeah.
But the main result of the plot came into being with the Act for the Queen's Safety, which was also known as the Bond of Association. And it bound all the signatories in an oath to prosecute and kill anyone who claimed the title to the throne as a result of the Queen's murder. And it was actually signed by Mary Queen of Scots.
Oh.
So you just think, wow, okay. And this act or this bond was part of what was used against Mary in 1586, because she'd signed this thing to say that they could prosecute and kill anyone who claimed the title to the throne as a result of Elizabeth's murder. And then Mary's letter later on is agreeing to Elizabeth's assassination.
Oh my gosh. And then she was like, I was just practicing my writing.
Yeah, she sort of condemns herself. So I think that's important to mention now, even though it won't sort of come into play until a couple of years later. But,
yeah. I don't think I knew that. I think that was a new piece of information for me. There's so much about this.
Yeah, I didn't realise that Mary had actually signed that either until I started looking into it a bit deeper. And I was like, oh, okay, she sort of condemned herself out of her own pen there.
There seems to be a lot of written evidence that comes to the forefront, isn't there?
There is, yeah. It's quite interesting once you start looking into it, the actual amount of evidence there actually is in these cases.
Yeah. So that was the Throckmorton plot. Is that what we're calling it?
Yeah. They have lots of different names.
So what happened after that? Was there any, well, I mean, I know when Mary Queen of Scots was executed, so we're getting close to that. Was the Babington Plot the next one? Yes, it is. The Babington Plot's the next one, and this is probably the most important one when it comes to Mary Queen of Scots' fate. So the Throckmorton Plot was 1583. We're now moving to 1586, so we've got a much shorter period between those two as what we had between Ridolfi and Throckmorton. So the Babington was the one that most interested me, just because it has a very obvious sort of double agent cipher. There's lots of sort of intrigue going on with this one. And
Mary Queen of Scots was once again moved, different location. She was moved to Chartley and was put in the care of a different jailer. She had been under the care of the Earl of Shrewsbury, but there was a suggestion that perhaps he'd fallen in love with Mary. They were having some kind of relationship, and that he'd perhaps been a bit too lenient with Mary, which is why she'd managed to send letters and receive letters and get involved in all of these plots. So she's instead put in the care of Amyas Paulet. So he was said to be a lot stricter. He had a lot more control over her correspondence, for instance, and the members of her household. And Thomas Morgan, who we mentioned in the previous plot, actually recruits Gilbert Gifford to this plot in 1586. Gifford's interesting because he was actually arrested when he arrived in England, and he seems to have perhaps become a double agent working for Walsingham. So we're already sort of seeing double agents sort of getting involved here. And there's a lot of questions over who exactly is a double agent in this plot and who actually is loyal to Mary. No one seems 100% sure whose side people are on. But Mary's communications, as I said, were really controlled, and then they were just stopped altogether. So at this point, Walsingham seems to have been desperate to get rid of Mary Queen of Scots, to find enough evidence that Elizabeth couldn't, deny the execution any longer. So this is why we think Gifford was probably a double agent, is that he was the one who persuaded Mary Queen of Scots that there was a secret way she could communicate, using a brewer who delivered beer to Chartley. And letters were put in waterproof pouches into the beer casks, and the brewer would then pass the letters to Gifford to then deliver to the plotters in London, and it worked in reverse for her to then receive replies. But Gifford didn't deliver letters directly to the plotters. They went via Francis Walsingham. So Walsingham knew from the start exactly what was going on. The letters were written in code, and the plotters did use a code, but Walsingham had his own code breaker, who was called Thomas Philippes, and he deciphered letters before they were delivered. So the letters would go from Mary through the brewer to Gilbert Gifford's hands, who would deliver them to Walsingham. Walsingham would then give them to Philippes to decipher, and then the letters would go back to Gifford to pass on to the plotters, and then it would all work in reverse to get the letters back to Mary from the plotters. So it all got a bit convoluted.
Yeah.
So that was sort of trying to figure that out, sort of blew my mind a bit as to how all of these different people sort of worked. And obviously Anthony Babington was the one who gave his name to the plot. He was sort of at the centre of this group of plotters in London. And he actually had a group portrait painted of this group of plotters, which were later used to identify them and arrest them.
Oh my God. Okay, does this portrait still exist?
I haven't found any evidence of it. So whether it was, destroyed once they'd caught the plotters, I don't know.
He's like, do you want to know who was involved? I had a painting done.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that when I read that. It was just, I think it might have been in Stephen Alford's book.
Okay.
Watchers. I hope I haven't got the author and the title mixed up there. I think that was the book. But yeah, so there was sort of this group of plotters, and they all seemed to be sort of fairly well off. They were all sort of gentlemen. We're not talking about sort of lower class, just general population. They, had land and could inherit things. And Babington wrote to Mary Queen of Scots, went through all of that palaver with the beer barrels and stuff, asking for her assent to a plot to assassinate Elizabeth I, to rescue her and put her on the throne. And Mary actually wrote back giving her assent, asking, wanting to know exactly what the plan was, giving advice on how they could best rescue her. So there was a suggestion they could set fire to the outbuildings And while the household was dealing with that, Mary could get away. So she was definitely involved in this. There's not really any possible deniability in it. And Philippes deciphered the letter before passing it to Walsingham. And the suggestion is that he actually drew a small gallows on the bottom of the deciphered letter.
Mm.
He realised they'd got Mary. She couldn't deny it. They had it, with her name on the bottom. And the plotters fled when they discovered a double agent in their midst. We don't know which double agent. The sources aren't clear. Whether they discovered Gifford was a double agent or whether there was someone else who was a double agent. And Babington himself was actually found hiding in a tree. So I don't think he got particularly far. Obviously realised he was being followed and thought, at this point, I just need to hide. I can't keep running.
In a tree.
Yeah. Apparently he blacked up his face so that it wasn't as visible. So that was
Wow.
go well. But the plotters were all arrested, condemned to death and executed. But the plotters were executed in 2 batches. So the first lot of plotters, which included Anthony Babington, were hung, drawn and quartered in the traditional way for treason. But Elizabeth actually commuted the sentence of the others, who were due to be executed the next day, after a public outcry. So they were hanged until they were dead before they were cut up. So I don't know, does that count as mercy?
She was like, okay, instead of letting you still be half alive by the time we disembowel you, we'll let you be dead first.
This season, a new hot deal has arrived at Metro. $25 a line for 4 lines with all the data you need and 4 free Samsung Galaxy A15 5G phones. Getting Metro's best deals is easy. No ID required, no activation fees. Get a new number or keep your own. It's up to you. That's 4 lines for $25 a line, plus 4 free phones. Visit a store or go online today. Only at Metro by T-Mobile.
When you join Metro Plus Tax, for a limited time and subject to change. Max 1 offer per account.
This Friday, from Disney, the musical movie event of the year arrives in theaters.
My name is Snow White.
Flawless.
Exquisite.
Get tickets now.
Waiting on a wind.
Snow White will have you on your feet.
I think that's a wonderful idea.
And cheering for more.
I was thinking the same thing.
Experience the magical story.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who's the fairest one of all?
Snow White. Disney's Snow White. Only in theaters Friday. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Tickets on sale now.
So that was sort of the end of 1586. We see that happen. I think it was August, September time we see that happen. And then we have Mary Queen of Scots moved again for the last time. She's moved to Fotheringhay Castle. She's tried in October 1586, so pretty quickly after sort of the rebellion ends. And then at Westminster, they determine that she's guilty and she should be executed. We have Elizabeth delaying multiple times signing this death warrant, or she signs it and rips it up and all kinds of things. But she does eventually sign it right at the beginning of February 1587. And her secretary takes it to the council, who make the decision to send it to Fotheringhay and authorise the execution without involving Elizabeth anymore. So Mary's executed at Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. When Elizabeth receives the news, she seems to be absolutely outraged that they've gone ahead and done it without her. Her secretary Davison is imprisoned, and for the first and only time in her reign, Elizabeth actually banishes Cecil from court. So it's the only time we actually see Cecil sort of not at court. She banishes other people and has them back, but Cecil's a constant until Mary Queen of Scots is executed.
Wow. It makes you wonder, did she do that just for show? Or, what was Elizabeth's intent? Did she actually intend to execute Mary Queen of Scots and knew it was the right thing to do? Or did she push back and really not want to execute her? I guess, is there any way we'll know the answer to that?
I don't think there's any way we'll know for certain. Personally, I think she knew she had to execute Mary. She didn't want to, but she knew for her safety she had to. But she didn't want to take responsibility for it. She didn't want people to be able to say, well, you did it.
Yeah.
So she signed the warrant, but left others to actually give the orders and to arrange it, and didn't want to hear about it until it was over, because then she could claim that she didn't know that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
She claimed that she just sort of signed the warrant almost for sort of security, so that she had it, but she didn't intend for it to be used.
It's almost, if you think about Elizabeth during the reign of Mary the First, it makes you wonder if Elizabeth was thinking about that. You know, my sister imprisoned me because there was a threat of me taking her throne, but she let me live.
Yeah, I think that was probably very much on Elizabeth's mind, because she knew how it felt to be the heir presumptive.
Yeah.
And although Elizabeth hadn't declared Mary her heir, it was generally accepted that if Elizabeth did die, it would be Mary who would take the throne. So yeah, I think it was definitely very much on her mind that she'd been in Mary's position before.
What a complicated situation to be in. And it's all the what ifs. What if Mary, Queen of Scots, had never left Scotland? What if she'd never had to abdicate her throne? What if, right?
Yeah, I mean, would any of these sort of rebellions have happened in Elizabeth's reign had Mary not been there? Because although there was sort of a big religious aspect to it, it was driven by the fact that Mary was there, she was in reach.
Yeah.
She was sort of almost an easy solution to sort of restore Catholicism. If you could just get rid of Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne, England would be Catholic again. So yeah, I do wonder whether any of the rebellions would actually have taken place had Mary not, fled to England.
Right, because we have 20 years of plots and rebellions, and it's all because of Mary, Queen of Scots, and religion.
Yes, and I think the only rebellion that probably would have happened is the last one, the Essex Rebellion. I don't think the others would have happened had Mary not been in England. There may have been a rising still about religion, it's possible, but I don't think any of the sort of plots that we see would have happened. And I don't think Francis Walsingham would have been as central in Elizabeth's reign as we have him today.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, well, you mentioned the Essex Rebellion. Let's talk about that. Who was he, first of all?
Well, Essex is Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was actually the stepson of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who we'll know as Elizabeth's sort of great love. And yeah, it's an interesting one, because this rebellion is very, very different to all of the others I discussed. This one's sort of a complete outlier, and it is in the sort of closing years of Elizabeth's reign. So we had the Babington Plot in 1586, and then the Essex Rebellion isn't until 1601. So we do have this big gap. I mean, they're very busy with a war with Spain at this point.
That's true.
Intervening years, and the problems in Ireland as well. So there is a lot of other stuff going on, and we have poor famines, and there's a lot going on in this period, which probably explains why we don't have the rebellions. The people are just too focused on living and working and
surviving.
Yeah. So this rebellion, there doesn't seem to be an overarching intent or aim. It seems to be essentially selfish. Essex just wants his power back. It's essentially the crux of it. But Essex had sort of ups and downs over the previous years leading up to the rebellion, with failed military and exploratory expeditions. He also made a secret marriage, which we know Elizabeth had big problems with people marrying without her consent. And he'd married Frances Walsingham, the daughter of Sir Francis Walsingham. So very sort of close tie to the centre of Elizabeth's court. And we see Robert Dudley die just after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So Elizabeth sort of has this gap where her favourite once was. And I think she almost sees Essex as a replacement. He is Dudley's stepson. He has that sort of familial tie to Dudley as well. But Essex is a very different character to Dudley. I think Dudley did genuinely love Elizabeth. I don't think Essex did. He's quite, from the sources we have, he's quite arrogant, and he seems to have tried to bully and manipulate Elizabeth, which she did not take kindly to at all. We have plenty of accounts of that famous Tudor temper. Didn't like being sort of overruled, and she was very aware of Her Majesty, and Essex just didn't really care about that at all. But Essex had a failed command in Ireland in 1599. We have a lot of rebellions and wars in Ireland at this time. And Elizabeth had instructed Essex to defeat the Irish rebels, but he actually negotiated a peace with them instead, which Elizabeth was, of course, furious about. And she refused to allow Essex to return to England and abandon his command. She instructed him he had to stay there and sort the problem out. But he actually ignored her, left his command in Ireland, came back to England. And she was at Nonsuch Palace at the time, and he barged into her chamber one morning before she was dressed. You know, she wore these elaborate wigs, lots of makeup, and she wasn't ready. And I think in that moment, Elizabeth's sort of idea of majesty was almost destroyed. Someone who wasn't one of her ladies had seen her without all of this sort of ornamentation that she usually had. And Elizabeth seems to have kept her cool in this moment. She didn't know if Essex had come with an army. She didn't know sort of what was going on. But she said, you know, she'd speak to him later once she was dressed. He left, but he was then arrested and put under house arrest once he was out of the Queen's sort of immediate periphery. He's put under house arrest. And Essex also, he seems to have spent lavishly. And as a result of this, he lost his monopoly on sweet wines, which was quite a lucrative sort of income for him. And because of his high spending, it meant he could possibly be threatened with bankruptcy at this point. So it was quite a sort of serious situation in Essex's eyes, at least. He didn't want to lose the power, the influence, the wealth. So he sort of brought together this sort of core group of his friends and allies at his London house. And they commissioned a performance of Shakespeare's Richard II, which is quite a contentious play at this time. Anyone who doesn't know the Richard II story, he was usurped by his successor and died in slightly suspicious circumstances. So there's a message of usurpation in that play and at the time, the play was sometimes removed. The play was almost censored. But they wanted the full thing played out. And it was said that this was a signal for the start of Essex's rebellion, that he was going to march through London to Whitehall, which is where the Queen had moved to, and he was going to force her to restore all of his rights, his wealth, his position at her side. So Essex had gathered his supporters at Essex House, and they marched towards Whitehall to try and get Essex an audience with the Queen. Supposedly he had someone within the court who was going to pave the way for that audience. But while they were doing this, they'd also locked members of the Privy Council in Essex House. So they'd come to Essex's residence to try and sort of talk to him, figure out what was going on, and he just locked them in. I don't think he wanted them to warn the council that he was on his way. He wanted that element of surprise. Although one of Essex's conspirators, while Essex was heading through London, got cold feet and let the councillors out. Honestly, realised they'd be in massive trouble if they imprisoned these privy councillors. And Essex's sort of march absolutely failed. He didn't even make it to Whitehall at all. He'd expected Londoners to join him on his march. For him. They didn't really care, to be honest. I don't think, they've had all these famines, and I don't think they were really bothered about what they probably saw as the petty squabbles of the nobility at this point.
Yeah.
There was some gunfire, and Essex's servant was killed, although a nice little anecdote that always makes me laugh is that Essex escaped this with nothing but a hole in his hat.
Oh.
Which, fair enough. Essex was, again, arrested, found guilty of treason, and he was executed on the 25th of February 1601, though his main supporter, the Earl of Southampton, was actually spared. Essex put in a good word for him and asked him to be spared, which was quite a nice thing for him to do. But this rebellion just makes me laugh because it just seems so ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I couldn't help but laugh where you're like, he's doing this for selfish reasons. He comes into London and is hoping these Londoners or these other subjects are going to join his cause. That's mainly just for him.
Yeah, he's not looking to improve, their social conditions or, change their religion. There's no sort of overarching aim in this one. It's just, I want my wealth and my power back.
Come help me.
Yeah. And it's not going to do anything for the Londoners except get them in massive trouble and quite possibly dead.
Yeah.
Essex just seems to have completely lost his mind at this point, which is quite sad, but it just seems ridiculous to me, frankly.
Yeah. In comparison to all the other rebellions and plots that we talked about, that one is the most ridiculous and unnecessary.
Yeah, I think comparatively, when you do compare them all, as I did in my book, this one just stands out like a sore thumb as being completely ridiculous in a way, and just it doesn't fit with any of the others that we sort of see happening, which have these much wider political and religious aims.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Helen, this was so much fun talking about this. Like I said in the beginning, rebellions and plots are usually not my cup of tea, but this was really interesting learning about how this all played out in the Elizabethan period in particular. It does make me wonder, if Elizabeth, let's ignore the fact that Mary was in there for a moment. Let's say Elizabeth was a male heir. It makes me wonder how different things would have been had she come to the throne as a male and still been a Protestant or been of the Reformed religion. Would there have been so many Catholic plots?
I don't think so. We don't see it with Edward VI. We just have that sort of one outstanding sort of prayer book rebellion with Edward VI. I mean, he didn't rule as long.
Yeah.
And I think Edward would have taken the Reformation further. So whether we would have seen some of these Catholic rebellions and plots coming in had he ruled for longer, I don't know. But I do think the gender was an issue, despite the fact that they wanted to replace Elizabeth with another woman.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they were trying to replace her with a male. I mean, at least not until after Mary Queen of Scots is executed, but then we don't see the same level of Catholic plots after Mary's executed. So it's quite interesting. And I mean, the last chapter in my book isn't focused on a specific rebellion. It just looks at rebellion under Elizabeth and how that sort of changed the face of Elizabeth's England and what the repercussions were of these. So there is that extra chapter in my book as well. But yeah, I think Elizabeth's situation being the first, what she's often called today, the first successful regnant queen. Mary's often dismissed in that, which I don't think is entirely right, because Mary faced problems that no one had faced before. So Elizabeth faced a very different set of problems. So I don't think it's entirely fair to compare the two directly. But yeah, Elizabeth's gender is always an interesting question, and I don't think it's one that we can just gloss over, because I think if she was a male, she definitely wouldn't have faced the same level of plots and rebellions, because kings were generally more accepted.
Right.
It wasn't until they massively stuffed up that we see these sort of overthrows. So yeah, I think Elizabeth's situation was quite unique, which is why it was so interesting looking at these rebellions, and the relationship with Mary Queen of Scots. Considering the two women never met, they are sort of inextricably intertwined.
Yeah.
Which is just fascinating to look at. And then that relationship's really at the heart of a lot of my book. Even though it's about Elizabethan rebellions, you can't ignore the Mary Queen of Scots relationship within that.
No, you can't. It's when it all started.
Yeah.
Well, Helen, if somebody wants to go out and get your book, Elizabethan Rebellions, or even your newer book, Tudor Executions, where can they find it?
They're both available direct through Pen and Sword. I do have copies of Elizabethan Rebellions signed. If anyone would like a signed copy, they can contact me directly through my website or social media if they want a signed copy. But yeah, they're available through most places you get books: Amazon, Waterstones, Foyles, Barnes and Noble in the US will have them. Yeah, it's pretty much available just about anywhere you'll get books, I imagine now.
And for those that do not know, what is your website?
My website is tudorblogger.com, and I am at tudorblogger pretty much on any social media platform you want to look at. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. I am also on Substack now, so you can sign up for my monthly newsletter over there as well.
Perfect. Helen, thank you so much for coming on the show again.
You're very welcome. I've really, really enjoyed it.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.